was requested of me to make a comment on the Ukraine situation, which I'm not really comfortable doing in terms of my own expertise, but I think that I have surveyed enough different opinions on this matter, or, I pretty much think I know all the different positions on it, but I must say that, it's embarrassing for me to sort of comment on this because my specific historical knowledge and context is vague. But I do think I probably have collected more pieces than the average person. But that still doesn't really make me qualified to really give an informed comment. But anyway, so I'm just going to frame this sort of idealistically as pieces of a puzzle and then try to almost philosophically or morally work out, where the balance should fall from a moral perspective, but that's not really the same thing as politics. So then I'll give a redress in terms of, so after clarifying the moral position, then sort of putting it into a political context, as far as I can see it. So Ukraine itself should be looked at in isolation in terms of what's going on inside Ukraine. So, you have that's sort of, I think, the centerpiece of the story. You have to work out what is actually going on inside Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is a very corrupt country. It's been corrupt for a long time, and Americans have been the ones corrupting it for a long time. When Biden was the vice president and his son was on, it's not like, what's the word? It's not a coincidence that Ukraine is in the spotlight. And, from the Obama presidency, when Joe Biden was vice president and his son was on the board of, all these foreign companies in Ukraine, foreign to the United States, it's sort of, these things aren't just lining up randomly. This is, sort of how, this is the more dirty side of politics. Um, so Ukraine is sort of politically corrupt. And we can see also this corruption spill over into sort of how mangled its supposed democracy is. It doesn't really respect freedom of speech. It doesn't really respect political, democratic, kind of processes. Um, People crack down on their political adversaries when they are in power. It's ugly because, let's say, the more democratic version of Ukrainian politics is perhaps something towards a middle ground within the internal structures of strife which exist within Ukraine, which is that there are a lot of sort of Russian identifying citizens within Ukraine who don't speak the main language, and they have been repressed by the majority Ukrainian sort of cultural majority. And it's not nice when your children can't sort of be taught in their native language. When there's this kind of minority, let's say, suppression. So there are real serious internal issues in Ukraine, and in some sense, sorry, now I'm jumping forward. Juxtaposing this with what the Russians have actually done. In some sense, although the Russian action is still, let's say, illegal from an international law perspective, it's not without its kind of pretension of moral auspice. There is an argument to be made there, in terms of sympathizing with people on the ground, but in terms of how many norms, international norms, it breaks, it is it is an unlawful act. But in terms of, it can be framed in such a way that it's noble. So it's not without its capability of being reframed. Now, I think a functioning democracy would respect, these enclaves of essentially Russians within the Ukrainian territory, which I believe are, you see, I'm even going to get basic facts wrong. I believe they're in the east of the country, um, whereas the Ukrainian bulk of the population, I think, is in the west. Now, obviously, this follows on from Crimea, um, which happened, some time ago, where Crimea was essentially annexed um, under the auspices of a kind of a gerrymandered referendum in order for Crimea to become independent so that it could become a Russian puppet. And, Russians were sending citizens to immigrate to Crimea in order to help sort of fix the independence referendum, because Russia was never going to allow Crimea, because obviously historically Ukraine is a satellite state, or was within the USSR, which is why there's so much sort of Ukrainian backlash against Russian rule or Russian influence. But Crimea was never, ever, ever going to become non-Russian, because the only access it's the only deep water access that Russia has to the Mediterranean. And if they give up access to the Mediterranean, it is such a blow geopolitically in terms of military strategic, being able to project power. It changes the game too much. It's too much of a concession to make. So although, sort of it's ugly in terms of on paper, everyone knew in terms of real politics this was never going to happen. Now, obviously, this is not a moral point to make, geopolitically, this was never going to happen. But I mean, this is actually how the world works. And you sort of, what they say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And, when you juxtapose this against the Monroe Doctrine that America has, um, under the Monroe Doctrine, I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis seems like a huge existential threat to America, but when you put that in historical context, Russia had its own Cuba pointing missiles at Russia in terms of Turkey, that there were ICBMs in Turkey that could have wiped out Moscow. So America was able to project nuclear power into Russia, but Russia was not allowed to project nuclear power that could reach America. So there has there's a real politics that goes on, um, and in the same way that the Cuban Missile Crisis was something that Kennedy actually had to confront as a political crisis, is the same kind of political crisis in terms of Crimea, in terms of Russia not giving up Crimea. So that was sort of, people know that was never not going to happen. Now, um, so Crimea was always going to be annexed, and it was never going to be given up. That's not even in the realm of possibility, because, I mean, let's just say that if the West, or if NATO, or if America was serious about constraining and confining Russia, um, on the same moral grounds around Ukraine, they could kind of make that around Crimea. But they don't even try. They don't even try. But they try for Ukraine. Now, obviously, the thing that makes Ukraine morally different, because let's just say there is a lot of people in Crimea who are sort of identify as being Russian, essentially. But maybe not even an absolute majority. We don't really know, because the referendum was basically fixed. But they wouldn't. Maybe they would have actually won it naturally. Who knows? Maybe it would have been slim, but they weren't going to chance it. So instead, you had a rigged referendum for the independence of Crimea, which was essentially annexed. But anyway, the thing that makes Ukraine different is history, in that Ukrainians do have a reticence, they do have a resentment against Russia, and they do want to politically align themselves differently. People could also argue that this is part of the internal corruption of Ukraine, because it's helpful to be able to have a kind of external scapegoat. It also helps mafia type governments operate because you've got a cohesive social binding force in being able to say that you're part of this geopolitical tug of war between Russia and America, etc. And that's also the elites in America have been part of this political corruption in Ukraine. It's really quite disgusting. And so there's so much corruption in Ukraine that you have to take all kind of politics from deeply corrupt countries with a huge grain of salt, because there's you don't know what is being obscured. And these big dramatic things are beautiful cover for just sort of mediocre government and corruption, because it all gets disguised in the stark narrative that's being cast. And if Ukraine was a more sensible democracy, then it would remove these issues off the table, because it would remove the pretext that Russia has for invading the East, because it would stop repressing its minorities within its borders, which in some sense people could argue is the more sensible democratic politics that would actually find democratic voice, except for the, let's say, the hyper partisan corrupt narrative that sort of has infected Ukraine, uh, or that it's prone to, that it's not capable of de-escalating because it's addicted to setting up this sort of fake polemic. So on so many levels, it looks like, what do you call it? It looks almost like a proxy, a Cold War kind of proxy thing that is being set up. And there are layers of geopolitics that are being played on top of layers of geopolitics. Um, you have the American military-industrial complex. Uh, it's hard to work out what the Russian benefit here is. Um, there are some sort of broad, nebulous ones, like um, the invasion that has just happened, in my view. If America countenances the invasion, it will be a kind of uh, watershed moment. So it'll be a landmark in terms of radically reframing the post-war order into that we are in a new epoch. We are in, what do they call it? Instead of a kind of, we'll be in a multipolar world, um, and great power politics and realpolitik, will be sort of will be more normalized, which in some sense might bring some more sensible thinking to geopolitics in general, because it has been warped by this kind of, what some people have described as a kind of liberal hegemony sort of idea, which has been very bad for liberalism, um, and very bad for kind of common sense, but pragmatism, but also, has created such a sort of a hyper partisan ideological kind of blind faith in terms of the so-called West. And I mean, you can see Germany is a perfect representation of Germany is already, I think, in this new epoch where Germany is off the board essentially, because, and we really have to thank that the world is so fundamentally interconnected, because otherwise we would have already had a kind of mercantile, in the same way that the mercantile system is all based essentially on acquiring the most gold, we would have already had empires re-emerge and colonization in some form. The only thing that stops that kind of colonization is the economic interconnectedness of things. And Germany being economically interconnected between Russia and Western Europe, or Europe, um, means that sort of soft power is more important. I do actually think that, we've lost, the West has lost a huge amount of moral standing, and it's lost a huge amount of de facto credibility, because of, let's say, the slipping of the mask of this liberal hegemony, um, that Biden has essentially facilitated. But I do actually think that this will have generally positive outcomes, because it will lead to more responsible and more sort of directly reasoned geopolitical stances. Because, you know trying to do something about a system, or sorry, not a system, a structure that is already sort of has so much corruption built into it, um, does lead, sort of into paradoxes on paradoxes. Um, yeah, right now Russia is framed as being quite, the naughty country, because it has, it's violating sovereignty, which is, sort of right up there. That's like the worst thing that you can do. That is an act of war, and it doesn't look like that there is a good enough I mean, you can't call this sort of a precautionary war or a defensive war or something like that. Or preemptive war. There's nothing preemptive about this. Um, so in some sense, I think it's probably more of a geopolitical maneuver, in terms of trying to shock. It's more of a comment. It's more of trying to frame America into a new epoch, contextualize the new geopolitical, um, structure. I mean, the Russians, I think, generally speaking, they think long term. So, although that this is a kind of chaos, and this is a kind of, sort of highly aggressive and, let's say, illegal in nature, uh, I think that it probably has some strategy attached to it. I mean, geopolitically, things have never moved this quickly for a very, very, very long time. I mean, the Saudi Arabia has allied itself with Iran. People thought that, that wouldn't even have been conceivable, but that was precipitated also by, um, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the way that it withdrew from Afghanistan. Uh, it completely rebalanced the political calculations. I think Russia might be trying to sort of segue into catalyzing or precipitating a new kind of politics. Anyway, that new kind of politics, I think, might be better for America, and better for the world, and better for everyone, because, um, new power structures, or new blocks, perhaps new political blocks, will perhaps start to be capable of being, of emerging. Because, in my view, the liberal hegemony geopolitical structure is marred by corruption, is marred by so many problems. What we really need is a league of open liberal democracies that actually care about having a kind of principled defense of one another, because they defend each other's principles. I mean, this is problematic, because in the West, internally, each country has is having a kind of, I mean, in my view of geopolitics is very different, because I take culture seriously, and I take morality and integrity seriously, and I do think that identity politics might as well be a kind of, in the same way that, you know Islamic fundamental cells can exist in a foreign country. I think that identity politics is an extension of China and Russia, but more so China in some sense. And, the West needs to get a handle on that, which it's, probably it's closer to doing. I mean, I just yesterday I just imagined something which I thought, well, it's meaningful that I can even imagine this, but it obviously it's very far from coming to fruition. But I just thought CNN might turn against woke politics. What if CNN became anti-woke? What happens if they evolved and adapted and actually, because I mean the Democrats are about to be slaughtered in the midterms. Maybe that will finally catalyze the resurrection of the Democratic Party into some kind of sane politics, which at the same time things like CNN will have to go through some kind of metamorphosis. But what happens if CNN actually became anti-woke? What does that look like? I mean, I think the left is, it's very hard for the left to do that because of psychological reasons, because to be anti-woke, you actually have to have a kind of psychological maturity, which many people on the left are not capable of doing because their whole political agenda and worldview is kind of like a structural developmental obstacle that they can't graduate from. And so they have to change their psychology, and that's asking too much for to get people's politics cleaned up. So but what happens if there's some kind of version of the left that can kind of you see the problem is that so much of the left is obsessed with power that they won't even make the moral move to try to create a more coherent democratic party because they will know that they're giving up too much of their constituency. They're giving up too much. There are too many. There's the slave morality that is identity politics is too politically. What's the word? It's too politically rewarding for them to forego it. Deprogramming these people is a lot of work, and all that work is diversionary from them attaining power. So their thirst from power really slows down their re-entry into sane politics, and especially the more far left you are, the more experimental and radical you are, the more you like the kind of the systemic oppression narrative, because if you promote dissatisfaction, that means, and you help destabilize the system, then it's the means that are justified because of the ends. So, and because you can always just kind of it doesn't matter that you don't actually have a decent plan of action, that you don't have a decent policy, and that your idea is just a kind of vague idea of socialism or collectivism or something like that. You can always just kind of, if you don't have a good plan, you can just focus on vilifying the ideological scapegoat, the 1%. So you can always just, the weakness in your own coherent policy can just be shifted into making a more critical campaign, making a more anti-ideologically aggressive kind of worldview. And so the left has always been hobbled by that kind of toxic cerebration, intellectualism. And it's not capable of putting that down. It's not capable of putting that toxicity down because they've relied on it too much. And they got greedy, and they thought, okay, this is going to be the last cultural cycle that we'll need to kind of take over everything. And having that wind down is too much for them to countenance, is too much for them to bear anyway. So, they don't really believe in libertarian values, and they don't care about vindicating libertarian values. And so they won't even help fix the system, because any force of destabilization, as far as they can tell, is politically part of their narrative of complaining about the system is just not good enough for us, even though they don't have a concrete solution to the problem themselves, because every time that they start creating concrete socialism policy, it very clearly abrogates and diminishes individual freedom, and it kind of devalues people on the libertarian level, which makes it look philosophically antithetical. But they always like avoiding that paradox, avoiding the manifestation of that hypocrisy, just by never actually making concrete policies and just using vilification instead anyway. So you know, America suffers from that. All Western societies, generally speaking, seem to suffer from that. And the journalists are too addicted to their own caged audiences. They're too addicted to their fear mongering because it's such an easy way to be sanctimonious and, pontificate and be respected, because then you're dealing in very important cultural issues, that you are almost like this mini lieutenant totalitarian because you are directing the culture from the middle as a journalist, and so all the wrong people are in the wrong positions, and to culturally clear these people out, um, in my view, takes like law. It takes having a good enough constitution that you can actually overcome the liberal intolerance paradox, and actually at least that it's legal and lawful for people to exclude these people, to have them cut out. To say, no, you're not allowed to join our institution because we don't accept you because you're toxic, and your ethics, your so-called ethics, are toxic. So, you need to be able to um, sort of sequestrate your culture and divide away from these people. And if your legal system is not capable of allowing the freedom of association to divide away from these people and to institutionally protect and gatekeep against this kind of toxicity, then you get this fudge, you get this disgusting moral equivocation. And that's what the West is suffering from, is that it doesn't have sharp enough tools to dissect the problem and to sort of cut it away within the institutional, because you get, I mean, in America you get all of these arguments which come from the fact that the Bill of Rights in America only applies against the government. It doesn't apply against other individuals, against other private forms of power. So you've got a set of rights which might have some good ideas and some good values in them, but they're not properly coherent. They're not, they're not broad enough to actually entrench, and so you get the DeSantis paradox in terms of, anyway, I don't want to repeat too many things from other recordings, but you know all of this is noise that is hard to solve, makes it hard to solve the problem, because you do need to actually have a kind of McCarthyist Red Scare commission of anti-American activities, but you need to have that in the law itself. You need judges to do this, and you need the law to be objective and everyone can read it and know what it demands of them, and so that you live in a coherent system that dignifies the individual, and that the individual can also use those powers and those rights also against the state and against other individuals, so that everyone has the same rights under the law, equal protection and equal benefit of the law, which doesn't exist in America. You only have equal protection, and the person who gets to make the rules is the democracy. So you live in a tyranny of the majority. You don't live in a society that actually respects the individual. So you don't have proper libertarian values. And those things need to be solved. Which, anyway, let me not go down that rabbit hole too much. So that's... Now, if you start having a model like that, then you can have other countries that say, let's create a soft power compact system so that we can stand up to China, and that we can also proselytize our liberal values like we used to, and say, we want other countries to have reform and to have these kinds of entrenched values. A new kind of liberal hegemony that's done in a kind of real political way, but it's also done in a way that's more protective than it is adversarial or aggressive. Because, I would all be about protecting Ukraine's democracy if it had a democracy that was respectable. Now, look, there is some sympathy to be had to the Ukraine. I mean, look, I know that what I just said sounds very crude, very blunt, and very harsh. But let me just say that even if you live in a corrupt democracy, it's still better, usually, the window dressing, some window dressing of a democracy can, is better than nothing. Some systems, because people can say, the American system is so corrupt. It's corrupted by the military-industrial complex. It's corrupted by big pharma. It's corrupted by, these big industries. that are colluding with governments and taking over government power essentially through lobbying and things like that. But America does have more political freedom in some ways. All of this is arguable, to a large extent, because you don't really have freedom of speech in America if you think about it. Because, I mean, if you go on TV and you're on live television and you say something and you defame a company, if you go and you make like you're going to get sued. So you have as many rights as in America as you can sort of defend yourself when the law is or if you, as much as you can defend your own rights in court. Um, anyway, I mean, this is every system has to have a trade-off, and you can't. There's no such thing as utopia, um, and you just have to hope that the law itself, has good substantive values laden within it, so that you get sort of legal precedents that are, let's say, culturally pragmatic enough, but also sort of morally edifying. Anyway, sorry, this is something that I shouldn't be talking about. Going off the topic. So, yeah, I mean, historically, you can almost sympathize with Ukraine, especially because of its history with Russia. Um, but it almost seems to me that this whole, whatever you want, this whole crisis was engineered from both sides, as far as I can tell, or at least it was, and we can also tell that. Look, I mean, I heard rumors long time ago that I mean, from sort of the Hillary Clinton side of politics, that Russia was going to be made out to be a bad guy because that was going to be what the Democrats used to galvanize support, is they needed a foreign enemy to sort of keep up to date their fear mongering and their hysteria, kind of cultural panic, is that is, so I do think that in some sense what's going on in Ukraine, even though the Russians are the aggressors, I don't know, to me it seems uh, it's a bit too convenient for the Democrats to some degree. It makes me wonder if there are sort of layers of politics that, you know, uh, in the art of war, they call it dead spies, people that play for both sides. Um, anyway, look, I mean, I'm just throwing out speculation here, but which is probably dangerous. And disrespectful to the people of Ukraine. But there are just so many pieces of this puzzle that, as far as I can tell, uh, either reflect the toxic nature of Ukrainian politics, because, why didn't Ukraine stop repressing its minority sort of Russian identifying peoples that live in the East? It could have just diminished that issue. There's so many elements of this which, in my view, seem like a manufactured. Um, the whole thing seems, in my view, a bit manufactured. Um, almost as if there is some kind of choreographed dance that is occurring that is meant to sort of create some kind of new, or engineer or usher in a kind of a new epoch. And maybe, that's just the Russians that are leading all of this. But maybe what the Russians are trying to do is they're trying to sort of inadvertently just make the point that Germany is no longer a European NATO actor. It is almost just trying to say, NATO is neutered. NATO has been pacified because of the German sort of reorientate. Maybe it's just trying to send shockwaves into the post-war alliance structure, or post-war, sort of system of great power politics. And, it's just sort of sending signals there. I mean, in my view, America really needs to start being, I mean, a lot of this could have been avoided. I mean, if you think about it, if Western pressure was put on Ukraine to treat the people in the east of Ukraine better, instead of moving towards an escalating conflagration, which now has precipitated in this. So I guess people can say, I'm talking about appeasing Putin and I'm talking about appeasing Russia. But I do actually think that in the same way that China was built up with the hope that it would become a liberal democracy, or it would become more overtly capitalistic, that is really more so how we should have been treating Russia. Because Russia has a different kind of culture to China, has a different history to China, and I think Russia would have been more receptive. And Russia really geopolitically represents a huge missed opportunity. I mean, the state that Russia is in is largely because of America's ineptitude, predominantly through the removal of Nixon, and man, I can't even remember who replaced Nixon, but whoever replaced Nixon completely fucked up on the Russia front in terms of helping facilitate a liberal democratic Russia, and helped it, which then meant that Russia became ruled by oligarchs, essentially. And Clinton as well was, when Clinton was president, there was also a reorientation with Russia. And Clinton just completely dropped the ball because Clinton was just bad at being a president. The one thing that a president of the United States has is their outfacing foreign policy. That's the one thing that the president really has full control over as the executive. And if Nixon had not been removed from office, look, I mean, I understand the Vietnam thing was a huge scandal and everything like that, but Nixon was probably sort of the last real statesman. Everything after Nixon was, that's what got Nixon into trouble, was just how real politics was he was a real political animal. And that's what got him in hot water and got him in trouble. And then sort of every president after that has maybe with the exception of Reagan, but Reagan also, there is some subterfuge with the Reagan presidency, although you could say it was an enlightened kind of subterfuge, which is it's a complicated issue that's not really relevant to this, but when I say subterfuge, I just mean in terms of the Reagan administration understood things about the trajectory of the American economy, which were never made public. and that also sort of extended the life of some things that we are economically suffering from now. But anyway, that's a very technical separate point. But it's going to be very interesting because what Russia might be trying to do in some indirect way as well is that when the alliance system in the West sort of completely cracks up at some point, or at some point it's de facto regarded as being diminished enough, this might be a pivot to deposing the petrodollar or something like that, which would also radically, we would be in uncharted territory. I mean, we're already moving towards uncharted territory into the multipolar world. So I don't know what the sort of the Russian end game is, and maybe in some sense it's just to change the face of geopolitical, sort of the dimensions of geopolitical politics. Um, but my inkling is that the West actually needs to incorporate Russia some way to try um, to indirectly put a check on China, because I do think that China's like a giant North Korea. Um, and China is going to start suffering from internal instability, and it might, you know, it's going to be, we're not going to know how that's going to manifest into China's geopolitics. Look, Taiwan is a very sore issue, and this is, Taiwan, I think, is different from Ukraine. Taiwan has a legitimate democracy, so I think it's more important for Taiwan to be protected. But in some sense, I almost wish that a little part of America could create, you know, that some big loan could happen and Taiwan could be rebuilt in the middle of America in some little place, and then everyone in Taiwan gets shipped over into this new Taiwan in America, and then all the buildings and industry that gets left over in Taiwan, everything that can get shipped over, and everything that's left gets conglomerated into a kind of corporation that sells itself to China. So that essentially the landmass of Taiwan gets sold to China with the buildings on it to try to recoup the building of the new Taiwan or something like that. And so that you could just kind of rescue the people from China and still keep a because I do think that Taiwan is very important to remain, because it's the only sort of section of Chinese people that remained free, that weren't sort of diminished by the experiment of Mao's China. Um, and there's a lot of cultural history and tradition and stuff like that which exists in Taiwan, which doesn't exist in China, because of that kind of that difference in cultural experience. And uh, I mean, that's a kind of cultural argument or a historical argument, but I think that it would be helpful geopolitically if Taiwan, in this way of export. Look, I mean, this is a crazy thought experiment, but the idea that I have in my mind is that if the Taiwan issue can become a non-issue, if it can just be over with, then that will remove the kind of, because Taiwan is a useful rallying cry inside of China. It's a useful propaganda sort of figurehead to harp on. It helps distract things, and especially as China's going to go through a lot of internal problems. So, look, I mean, I guess I'm all about appeasement because I want to help crystallize the issue uh, in a way that is not, because the only way to actually to protect Taiwan is to have a league of liberal democratic open countries using their soft power to compel China to stand down because it risks to lose too much. And they can also start to put real pressure internally into China. Um, because essentially I can imagine that a league of countries could set up a kind of, in the same way that the European Union has its common market trading bloc, that we need to develop trading blocks that are based on values and principles, and that is how also these countries will protect each other from the soft power that exists. I mean, China and Russia combined is like more than a third of the country of the landmass of the world. It's crazy. I mean, I can't remember what the actual statistic is. I think what I said is true, but it's some crazy amount like that. Like Russia and China combined is like at least a quarter of the world. I think they are massive. They have so much of so much. It's crazy. Um, and the sanctions against Russia have made it more politically agile geopolitically because they're, they they have done import substitution. So this gives them the capability to make more risky sort of. I do think that the weak link in the chain in terms of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the treaty between Russia and China, which effectively makes them a single military unit, that needs the West needs to be serious about essentially dismantling the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it needs to, instead of having a China policy, it needs to have a Russia policy, because that will indirectly be the best China policy. And this Ukraine thing is something that didn't have to happen, something that could have been avoided from the West. Unilaterally, the West could have avoided all of this by essentially not even de-escalating, just not escalating the issue in the first place, which in my view is a front for corrupt politics and corrupt money. Essentially in the same way that maybe nomenclatura in Russia would have satellite states that then they would sort of have use as a fiefdom and extract resources from for these very rich elites within the USSR. In the same way, the American empire, Ukraine has been this kind of satellite fiefdom in the American empire for American politicians to do backroom deals and do military things with the military industrial complex, and all of that has been so divorced from actual strategic goals. Tucker Carlson makes perfect arguments as to why Ukraine should be an afterthought for America, but I do actually think it's the opposite. It's that America should have, Ukraine should have been the fig leaf that was being offered to Russia to remove the internal, because what you should do is you should engage in a diplomacy with Russia where you monitor its internal propaganda and you actually use soft power to give Russia a treat when it is de-escalating its propaganda, and that because that is how liberalism spreads. Liberalism spreads when you don't have these tribal geopolitical kind of conflagrations and strife that can be used to create an us and them paradigm, so that you can start to normalize things, and that also then you can try, because I mean the problem with all of these systems is that they have real corruption in them, and the real corruption is nowhere close to being addressed. And that is the thing which makes them addicted to these narratives, which, in my view, are being escalated in the West because of other nefarious reasons, because of the West is, well, America is corrupt in this way. So I do think that what we're seeing is a symptom of corruption, but from various different sources that just end up collaborating and affecting what they are. So, in my view, Germany, instead of being the odd one out, everyone should reorientate their politics like Germany, but work out a way of leveraging soft power against Russia, because soft power is how you change political structures, is how you also move against corruption. Instead of crying over revolutionaries in Russia, or let's say opposition parties in Russia who are never popular. The reason why they're not popular is because of all of this propaganda that Russia has internally about its geopolitical adversaries. And in some sense, I think it does have geopolitical adversaries, but it's just corruption feeding off corruption. It's the oligarchy in Russia colluding with the oligarchy in the American military-industrial complex to have a faux conflagration in Ukraine, and it cements both for different reasons. It's actually, it gives it's a financial boon for the American corrupt establishment, and it's an ideological necessity for the oligarchy in Russia. So that's what I see. And I don't see anyone trying to actually manage that problem. No one cares about that problem or framing that problem, because that's the actual long-term solution to all of this, as far as I can see. I mean, look, this is, maybe what I've said oversteps the mark, and it's because, I'm just historically uninformed. But I think it's somewhat dangerous to just kind of if your analysis, if your moral prescription and your moral analysis is not tethered to a long-term solution that actually resolves all the issues, then what are you even thinking about? What are you even doing? You're reasoning in the middle of nothing. So unless you actually have a general roadmap that actually deals with the more structural fundamental problems, you are really just treading water in a way that plays into the hands of the corrupt. So I would even countenance more, let's say, radical concessions that some people might, appeasement more. I would even countenance more kinds of radical appeasement if it's part of a pragmatic political strategy that actually ends up resolving the problems at the core of it. And that politics just doesn't have a voice, because it's not really no one in mainstream media really shines a light on that kind of long-term visionary politics. But also because you have to get into real politics, and you have to sort of be serious about things in such a way. And everyone is addicted to moral grandstanding. Everyone is addicted to kind of shortcuts and expedient kind of frames that sort of look at the issue on a level of detail which helps them seem like they're making a solid interpretation, or makes them look like that they have responsibly, that they're dealing with all the things in play. But if all the things that you're dealing with are not enough of the things that can actually lead to a general resolution, then I would say that what are you doing? You're just playing into the hands of someone who is of some source of disquiet in the system, and you're just part of the churning. You're part of the tumultuous, the crests and the trough of the sea. You're just a kind of a dead body of water being acted on by these other forces, and you say, well, it's not our fault. The moon made the tide come in and made the tide go away. No, you should know how the fucking moon works. Put it into your equation. Put it into your planning. It's not as if these things, we don't have measurements of these things, and I do think that Russia can be a you know you know the people who control Russian politics, I think, could even be assisted in cleaning up the oligarchy, or at least putting the oligarchy in such a way that it limits that it maybe it doesn't threaten it, but it kind of stabilizes it in such a way that it makes people more in Russia uh, have more access to cleaner markets, if I can just frame it like that, um, and a more authentic participation in a free market, which I think over time creates a culture that makes democracy more genuine, and that anyway. But there's a lot of supplementation that's gone on in the Russian political system, and a lot of that could have never had to happen. A lot of that is a direct response of the ineptitude of the American system that just at the right moments stood back. I mean, Putin was trying to get help from Clinton, and Clinton just did not engage. And Putin was left having to contend with oligarchs and making peace with oligarchs, and he was not being helped from the outside. You know, when people say that Putin is not an angel, he's also not a devil. He's a pragmatist and he's a realist. And every time that he tried to have an open hand, uh, it was met with a kind of indifference and with a kind of I mean, you could call it a kind of American tunnel vision, but I mean that's because American presidents, well, specifically Clinton. Clinton uh, was just completely inept. I mean, he was just an idiot essentially. Anyway, you can't really cry over spilt milk. You can't really complain about history. You have to sort of make a plan about the present. But yeah. Okay, this is an addendum to my initial recording. I realized that I must sort of clean up how I was kind of moralizing quite sloppily at the end there into creating, a bad formula of how to deal with these things. It's not so much. Look, I mean, sometimes you do have to choose the lesser evil in terms of, but a better way I think of framing what I was trying to get at is that you have to treat causes and not symptoms uh, when you can do so, essentially. And you have to sort of frame all the sort of causative elements and features that are leading to manifestations. There's no point in sort of being half blind to and so that you are constantly mopping up the same symptoms which keep on precipitating. Um, you have to sort of take account of all the causes that you can take account of before you sort of start making prescriptions. Or coming to a settlement on what sort of the optimized treatment of the situation is. Okay, this leads me to go on to uh, add some further. Um, so I mean, what I'm about to say was sort of are things that I've kind of intimated in other recordings and in my other forms of political analysis. But I just realized that my last recording that this is an addendum to was a bit shoddy because of not making this explicit. So I just want to say that the reason why having the semblance of a democratic culture and a democratic politics is better than just an overt, crude authoritarian one, where you is because culture itself is a kind of soft power, and I think that the only way to actually improve situations, improve systems, and actually have reform and actually have fidelity and integrity within structures is that it has to come from the culture on some level. Now, I have said that, I think that there's a huge connection between the law and culture, that, people say politics is downstream of culture, or I think culture is downstream of the law. So I do think that you need to sort of improve the the legal tradition, the legal culture, as it were, the ethos which is implicit within the legal theory, eventually, I think, permeates the culture. Anyway, and what I mean by that is that when you don't have a coherent system, I mean, it's not enough to have the law. If the law is perfect on paper, it's not enough, because culture then becomes the watchdog, So it's like, just because you've got everything great on paper doesn't mean anything if a culture isn't willing to sort of use those tools and use those instruments that are that are at hand, So there's a certain kind of cultural corruption and complacency which can also depose a system. So it's not a sufficient condition that the law is refined. But I do think that you can get a refined legal system by having a culture that is aware enough and has enough integrity and is transparent enough. That is how you actually get a more coherent system that has real integrity in it, is that it has to be culture-led. It has to be led by the soft power. And, this, is why it's obviously it's a very depressing thing when mainstream media and, let's say, the tradition of having, sort of investigative journalism and, kind of proper, let's say, political commentary and social critique and all these sorts of things that journalism should be imbued with, has all sort of been deposed by, I don't know, like big corporations or something like that. And how everything has sort of gotten into weird kinds of fear mongering and moral grandstanding over sort of half baked issues, um, which then you can just kind of rinse and repeat, and then you never actually get any progress anywhere. So yeah, I'm trying to say that sort of the progress that people should be aiming for is a kind of cultural progress of a kind of a more intelligent, sort of political discourse and a more intelligent analysis of issues and things like that. Um, which does really center around the industry of journalism or sense making and the industry of moral discourse itself within a society, and sort of and so like when you look at media and you look at journalism and you just look at the low quality and the low bar and the kind of and the groupthink kind of narrative echo chambers, um, and this false equivocation sort of between um, people who don't accept the facts from your echo chamber or something like that, which in my view just is designed to crowd out actually moral thinking and thinking from first principles, and reasoning from values and from basic libertarian values. And so we're living in a world in which basic libertarianism has taken a huge knock. Russia used to be on its on a much shorter leash just because of the soft cultural pressure that libertarian values applied across the world. It was more mediating than America. It was more mediating than sort of the American world police liberal hegemony kind of model of politics. Was essentially that you don't want to look uncivilized. You don't want to look, sort of um, like a villain, essentially. But now, moral standards have been so contorted and warped by identity politics, which is essentially gives carte blanche to this, politics of a kind of national tribalism and us versus them, and, sort of these bubble realities that are based in, sort of being cynical about things because, identity politics, has a kind of uh, uh, moral relativism baked into it, which exactly leads to the kind of corruption that we're sitting with at the moment, which is where you have a kind of de facto collusion between, or as I've sketched out, the oligarchs in Russia are colluding with the military-industrial complex in America, as far as I can see. That's my analysis. Um, and the only way to actually combat this, although this sounds, is to actually look. Germany might look, and in some sense you could say that Russia is trying to use Germany as a wedge against NATO and against the West, saying, ha ha ha, you can't get your act together because Germany can't now, Germany is no longer a Western power because it's too captured by, economic ties to Russia and its ties, in terms of fulfilling its energy demands. Which, by the way, are also a product of them turning off all their nuclear power stations and, sort of having all this crazy energy policy. So, yeah, these kinds of these liberal virtue signals, although to even call them liberal, I know, the woke virtue signaling, which has sort of taken over politics and is such a basket case of diversions and, sort of abrogations of basic responsibility, so much so that, then real politics is, oh, well, the only thing that tackles real politics is something like gritty and nasty like identity politics, and everyone developing their own sort of nasty nationalist identity politics. Um, you know, which is coming from the Democratic Party in America, which is coming from the left. And so, for this to be, for these problems eventually to sort of come out in the wash, we're going to need, um, in my view, it's really, the sounds, it's the man in the mirror is the problem, is that each country really has local problems to deal with. And, you can't really fight for a liberal democracy abroad if you don't really have a functioning liberal democracy anymore in your municipal country, in your municipal, democratic polity, So cleaning up the polity and cleaning up this filth or whatever, is something that is not really on people's radars. And I think the more that we sort of involve ourselves and embroil ourselves into sort of, sort of twice removed ostensible virtue signaling on top of ostensible virtue signaling that all plays to a narrative, which in my view is like a narrative that is too far removed from any kind of actual defense of the actual values themselves, because the values themselves are just fundamentally, they're just cardboard cutouts, they're just pretending. It's just all LARPing on top of LARPing on top of LARPing. And I don't think that's, I think that we need to get back to soft power. We need to, like, if we want to put pressure on Russia, it should not even have to fall on governments to put pressure on other governments and sanctions. It should be soft power. It should be like it used to be in terms of, promoting the cause of women in the third world and promoting non-sexism in the third world. It should be on that level of cultural proselytization and cultural outreach and the use of soft power to apply pressure to these things is how these things are actually substantially novated, how they actually get rectified. And, because we keep on trying to, because we keep on empowering people with these moral grandstanding, sort of hollow sanctimonious, and they're pretending to stand up for liberal democracy, but, it's just a kind of morality play. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to get back to basics, and we have a lot of recovery and rejuvenation to do before we can even be serious about, sort of promoting these ideals and these values in foreign countries. It really doesn't make sense. And look, I understand that in the interim, ostensibly Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine is likely not going to be conquered by Russia. Right now, even in terms of what they've done, although they have trampled on international norms, they are violating the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Superficially, there's a prima facie case for what they are doing, which is also interestingly kind of using some of the rhetoric of the West against itself. Almost quite cynically and also quite masterfully in terms of sort of pointing to the hypocrisy of the West, which it is somewhat guilty of. Now, look, just because Russia and the West are both guilty of this hypocrisy, and I do think that they are both used as excuses to, look. Let me just say that I'm slightly grateful to Russia, not for what it's doing in Ukraine, but just for existing as an independent source of power to the American structure. Because imagine if this world was just completely ruled by the military-industrial complex in America. It wouldn't be great. Now, obviously the American system is better and superior, morally superior, because even though it has these vested interests and these entrenched, corrupt, deep state structures, at least, it has a higher functioning pretense of liberty and freedom and power, but which in my view is somewhat corrupted because it's all a bit of a morality play, because of the legal theory in America is really undignified for the individual citizen. You become a pawn of the democracy. You have to live in the tyranny of the majority, and it isn't properly tempered. It isn't coherently brought into a kind of accountability with being self-consistent, and that is problematic, because that is how the corruption actually finds itself into puppeting that system, is because it can kind of sneak in there through sort of playing into morality grandstanding within the political domain, because then it's always this overshooting and this it's an unsophisticated political game that the culture is also complicit in promulgating. So this is not a political corruption. It is a cultural corruption as well. I'm trying to say that the reason why America has a corrupt system is not because of the legal deficiency of the system. It's because of a cultural deficiency. It's because they actually have rationalized a culturally wicked kind of nescience, and it comes, it's a combination of cultural corruption as well as a corruption in the law itself, in the structure of the law itself, and the constitutional framework in America gives room for this, and it's not really capable of uprooting it, except if you actually get some more cultural awareness of this. America has been in a bit of a kind of moral catch-20. Oh no, let me try to phrase this properly. America has been in a kind of, has consciously been in a kind of moral vortex bind ever since Vietnam, or actually ever since the Civil War. I mean, I think you could make an argument the American structure never properly processed, like the 14th Amendment and states' rights has always been a kind of a thorn, has always been a sore point, and it just doesn't have a properly assimilated constitutional framework. It doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite, only in the 1950s was it decided that the Bill of Rights and the federal constitution actually applies against the individual states and not just against the federal government. So you've got like this propaganda in the federal constitution that, these are all the values that we stand for, but these values only apply against the government, even if it is state and federal. And quite frankly, it's just not good enough. Like those ideals that protect you against the government, they don't protect you against Google. They don't protect you against lots of things. So, unless you can kind of completely banish all monopolies to make sure that you're not going to have any sort of collusive cartels that have much too much influence over their markets, I would say that, even if you have a way to balance the power in society, that's not enough. You actually need to actually have accountability, like conceptually, so that it can be understood in a rigorous way, in a coherent way, so that everyone knows, how their controversies can be resolved. And because right now people don't have enough claims within the structure. They only have as many claims as the democracy invents for them, and the democracy is actually limited. The democracy can't exactly regulate that freely against the private industry, nor would you want it to be able to. You don't want to, whether the big brother is constructed out of a kind of authoritarian system or if it's founded out of the majority. Like the tyranny of the majority is not that much better than a tyranny of corporations, and so like you need something to mediate this, and that really is the role of legal theory and a judiciary essentially, and why you need something that's more substantively the rule of law than the procedural definition that America gives to the rule of law, which is quite frankly just not good enough. You need a substantive benchmark in terms of the rule of law, which the American system that's given over fully to the role of the democracy to kind of make this experimental history in terms of supposedly discovering the public good, and as they move the goalposts on their own ideals, they can never sort of recapture the it's just constantly reacting to things. And this system has already fallen apart. It already has been showed, as soon as you had the McCarthyist Red Scare and the Committee Against Anti-American Activities, that was necessary to save the American system. But when it did that, it produced a kind of deep fundamental hypocrisy in the experiment that America is founded on fundamentally, which is that you're not allowed to have politics socially engineer the democracy or socially engineer society. Like, you have to be at the mercy of the electorate. You have to be at the mercy of the democratic process, which is exactly what was violated by the McCarthyist Red Scare now and the Committee Against Anti-American Activities. Now, I believe that you do need to have something that fulfills that function, but it needs to be incorporated into the law coherently and where everyone can see what the rules are, and the rules, because that is actually the antidote to the entire deficiency in the system. Because when you actually have the proper rule of law and everyone is subject to the same law, and then the individual can use that same law to protect themselves against the government and also perhaps against other private forms of power, then you've got they live in the same society and they are all yoked by the same system of justice. Instead, this equal protection of the law, which gets invented by the democracy, means that they can just move the goalposts and they can be as inconsistent and have no proper responsibility, or you can turn accountability into a game where you are disguising your own iniquity, disguising your own irrationality by just sort of promulgating a new scapegoat, creating a new rationalization of the problem, where you're just sort of moving the buck or passing the buck forward onto some new half-baked idea. And I mean, I've already given specific examples how I think that at some point the Supreme Court of Appeals, sorry, I can't remember the name of the top court in America, SCOTUS. I've described in other recordings how there are certain sort of dilemmas or quandaries which are latent within the American system, which I think they cannot actually resolve. That either way, as soon as, if they start trying to, because they have to develop the jurisprudence, but they've kind of got a fundamental inconsistency. And at some point, it's going to overtly break the American system, or at least they have to try to avoid it looking that way. But in some sense, the fabric of the American constitutional framework is like, it's untenable. It actually needs to be improved on sort of holistically and systemically. But you don't have liberal philosophers working on this problem because, this kind of revolutionary reform or semi-revolutionary, I mean, you could call it constitutional reconvention. You need something like a constitutional reconvention. And this is something that usually would be sort of in the wheelhouse of the left's intellectualism, but they are too busy trying to sort of win popular power for their identity politics, systemic oppression, sort of toxic psychology, their greed for power means that they can't actually deal with these problems. They're not interested in trying to just improve libertarian values and libertarian philosophy. It's one of their enemies in some sense. It's one of their adversaries. They don't want to make it look like that it can work out, because if it looks like it can work out, it helps stabilize the system, and they are chaos merchants. They prefer the destabilization. So we've got, and this is obviously, this is why I think the left is going to have a huge propensity towards developing into fascism, which was predicted by the Italian Marxists who all turned to fascism, because they worked out that, if you actually take the orthodox Marxist thinking, which was the tradition that they inherited, they worked out, if you're not going to go Leninist, then you might as well just go fascist, because it's about the same thing. It's about the same sort of political strategy. It's just slightly different window dressing, perhaps. But as soon as you actually start applying things in practice, you might as well be fascist. It doesn't make that much difference whether you're sort of state capitalist or state socialist, whatever the hell you want to call it. It doesn't really matter if you're a Leninist or if you're a fascist. It's a slightly different form of education that you give to children, but it's basically almost formulaically identical in terms of how it works psychologically. Okay, it is a little bit different, but it's not. It's a difference without a proper distinction, I think. Anyway, man, I really went all over the place here. I just wanted to say essentially that culture is, in my view, the touchstone. Culture is the. Let me find. I made a. Culture is the keystone. With a more refined culture, you can clean up corruption. And that is also how you don't get collectively gaslighted by some kind of subterfuge, some kind of, because being the victim of subversion, because there are two sources of subversion. There is sort of people making narratives that perhaps should be seen as invalid or not properly substantiated, because the legal system gives you enough rights as an individual to stand up to people who are trying to sort of warp the democratic
political process. And the only way to properly close the door on that is to sort of, get a better, coherent legal theory that, actually means that there's real accountability within the public sphere, and also, in terms of keeping politics clean to some degree, where people can't just hide behind, sort of democratic mandates and then do overtly sort of corrupt things, where they trample on libertarian values. And just by the way, how that would work essentially is that you would have essentially constitutional obligations and duties that government was, by the Constitution, tasked with upholding. And, what would happen, and then a constitution which would also contain a Bill of Rights and things like that, which would enshrine freedoms and things like that, and general values under different headings. And so what would happen is, as an individual, if you were being affected by government policy which was having an untoward effect, either it was not carrying out its purpose, the actual, because, generally speaking, therefore, when legislation is drawn up, it would say that, it's seeking to fulfill this mandate that the government has to act. And so then you would put that in context in terms of the effects that this policy is having. And if the policy, in some sense, because look, everyone's rights can be limited according to the limitations clause, so it's a bit of a trade-off, but essentially, if it's obvious that the policy could be slightly altered in order to not limit people's rights, like, what are you actually getting for the trade-off? Is there some kind of efficacy that is being provided by, sort of, so like, is it justifiable in a liberal, open, democratic society, according to the purpose of the legislation, and and the extent of the limitation of the right, and the nature of the right that's being limited by this policy. So, if this policy is essentially, you can literally do a calculation. You can say, well, if you just change this policy slightly, it wouldn't have all of these negative effects, and so you could, you can save yourself from bad government policy by essentially beseeching a court to just say, this policy could just be changed slightly, and it wouldn't have this huge negative effect, and it would hardly change the nature of the policy. And so essentially, you would not be guarded by abstract morality. You would be guarded by literally saying, the policy could literally, instead of saying X, it could say Y. So basically, you would, the best way, I think, to make this argument in court is you just basically say, no, look, this is all you would have to do is change the policy, to change the wording of this regulation, to change the wording of the legislation in these small ways, and it would have these big effects, and it wouldn't have, unintended consequences, and it would otherwise be the same kind of policy. And so you are literally protected by literally being able to sort of out-government the government in terms of a court of law, by just basically saying, look, this is irresponsible policy. And it doesn't matter that the democracy endorsed that policy. It actually violates values which should be protected, my individual rights and values, and we can all just you could use the reasoning in the Constitution, essentially, and then the courts can essentially either send it back to the democracy and say, look, we're ordering you to change these, so that's how it's been done in the modern South Africa, on paper, which is that what the court will do is the court will say, we won't change the legislation. What we will do is we will write an alternative part of the legislation, and we'll say, Parliament, please fix the bill, and if you don't fix the bill by a certain date, then the revision that we have, sort of made preemptively will come into effect. So it'll be automatically updated if Parliament doesn't find their own way of doing it. So you give the democracy the potential to sort of to fix their own mistake, as it were, or to reinvent the wheel if they want to sort of reshape the whole sort of structure of the policy itself. That will also hopefully fix the same problem, or if they want to sort of reinvent the whole sort of logic of that form of policy. But anyway, this sounds very messy and things like that. But essentially, in a case by case basis, you can actually say, no, this policy oversteps the mark. This policy is actually unreasonable in terms of how it is intruding on individual rights, or a few people's rights, or a group of people's rights. And obviously, this is not going to be entertained if the right that is being infringed is like not a very important one, or it's not being infringed on very seriously, because the values and the rights in the Constitution are actually quite broad. They're just there for people to basically say, to potentially be an umbrella that individuals can use to protect themselves from the tyranny of the majority, quite frankly. And so, the majority is bound collectively by the Constitution just as much as the individual is bound, and the one can leverage this against the other. And so everyone is bound by the same rule of law, and they have the same instrument of protection and benefit. And in a supreme constitution that is higher than the democracy, essentially. And this also forces a kind of accountability on the democracy. Now, obviously, I think that this is all eminently reasonable, and this only looks weird once you corrupt the whole process by actually not taking values seriously and reducing values into protocols and into weird forms of rationality and things like that. Then you can kind of create crazy because essentially what this should do is it should put pragmatism at the center of the question, which means that you're not going to let government policy get watered down or washed away because somebody else can sort of cry over spilt milk, or some little problem. It's not there for someone to dismantle a whole thing just because they have a little problem. It's about proportionality. If you read the limitations clause in the South African Constitution, proportionality is a huge thing. And well, which also, well, I'm just framing it like that, but proportionality has a lot to do with the intrinsics of the equality clauses, the equality subclauses. Section 9 of the Bill of Rights anyway, so you really have to take Section 9 and read it with the limitations clause when you're dealing with questions of proportionality. And the one thing that you can't get around there is equal protection and benefit of the law. The kind of that law has to sort of be objectively applied. That the law must stand applied evenly. That everyone must be equal before the law. The law itself can't be capriciously, sort of interpreted. And you get into weird kind of disgusting morality contrivances and strange kinds of. Anyway, I'm really getting, but I'm really getting into the weeds here. But yeah, so I do think that. I mean, you see, when you have a legal structure that's like this, I think it actually ends up breeding a kind of common sense pragmatism and realism in the electorate or in the culture itself that will actually respect reason and will respect sort of negotiation and grappling with things in a very honest way, in a very authentic way, in a way in which people don't allow themselves to get into corrupt forms of political culture and corrupt kinds of, sort of narrative game playing, narrative witchcraft that we see in identity politics and racial consciousness and, solidarity with the black identity or whatever sort of black totalitarianism is being brewed in the cauldron of this, disgusting zeitgeist that we're all living through right now. But that, if we actually had defended and not betrayed our non-racialist and non-sexist constitution, we wouldn't have allowed ourselves to indulge in this kind of democratic illiteracy which has exploded. But the rest of the world already had this kind of democratic illiteracy endemic in their culture and in their structure, because their legal theory already had a kind of over-reliance on democracy, and so they never had like a coherent engine and a coherent structure to measure society against, and to keep everything within some kind of moral context in which you could actually deal with it and not fall prey to the kind of the narrative witchcraft, but essentially that cultural zeitgeist of academics lending credibility to the racial consciousness, sort of demagogues, has essentially completely poisoned democracy, at least in my country. If you can even call it democracy, especially with, how the journalists have just all cottoned onto this and normalized this kind of basic totalitarianism. So, anyway, man, all I do is ever talk about this. But so, in my view, this is a much, like, man, I really hate to say it in this kind of crude way, but, fighting over Ukraine, in my view, is such a sideshow to the real threat that liberal democracy has at the moment, that to get involved in that kind of farce, I think, already lends more chaos to the chaos merchants and to the destabilizers. That, in my view, it's not worth fighting over. Also, because I think that Western Ukraine is not going to be. When a country has already been invaded, that's a very serious thing on the face of it. And so, I'm already appeasing the sovereignty that has already been violated in Ukraine. But I do think that the Russian ostensible idea that they are peacekeeping the eastern parts of Ukraine is not without merit. It's not, it's not something that can just be completely easily refuted. Because that, you could say, well, the Ukrainians had a right to treat their minority in that way, to treat their Russian-speaking people in a quite a disgusting way. Now, you see that when I talk about that individuals should have protection against their governments using constitutions, you see, I'm standing up for a kind of libertarian fundamental value system and constitution, which does not exist in the so-called democracy of Ukraine. Ukraine is just another tyranny of the majority. So, excuse me if I don't really care about defending a system that, in my view, concocted its own downfall in terms of poking the bear, quite literally, or geopolitically speaking. You're talking about something that was already a corrupt democracy. So, I'm sorry that I'm just not that sympathetic on some level. For me, the people, in history, I think, there are other people that are deserving of more sympathy, like the people in South Africa who held out an olive branch to the ANC and for people asking for liberation. that then sort of never gave liberal democracy and open society a chance. They never gave freedom a chance. And now they're doubling down on racial consciousness, and the whole thing is, getting more and more corrupt by the day. And no one, we don't have any kind of honest commentary on this thing. There's a YouTuber out there called Economics Explained, who's an Australian, I think, or a New Zealander. He's got one of those accents. And he does all these little videos on economic topics. And when he did South Africa, it was the most disgusting commentary that I've ever heard. It was just completely obsessed with the Gini coefficient and the inequality in society. This is someone who usually focuses on proper economic analysis and actual, he actually usually talks about how governments have been bad and how they've been good. He hardly, he just gives, sort of the government in South Africa a complete sort of pass because of the toxic racial politics, essentially, and the politics of inequality, which is, exactly this kind of, leftoid sympathy grifting narrative witchcraft. So, it's amazing how much evil gets lost in terms of actually being able to coherently confront evil and deal with proper causes of things. Um, anyway, there are further things that I could go on to talk about how the culture in South Africa is potentially part of the problem, but it's just sad that the legal system, which was designed in some sense to be a proper backbone and a proper scaffolding, and on paper it really has this capacity, was betrayed and diluted to such an extent in which now we have a kind of a hodgepodge system that has normalized totalitarianism. But I mean, I guess this is the state that the whole world is in, roughly speaking. So yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I want to concentrate on, and I do actually think the context in which to increase the cultural awareness of these things is in a context like Germany, in a context that at least there's enough peace, there's enough sort of harmony, and there's enough mutual interests to stop things from exploding, that maybe then they can actually listen to some good ideas and improve their sort of political culture, if I can put it like that. But I mean, continental European culture, as far as I can tell, is just very, very corrupt. And, sort of Habermas, I think, is sadly a sort of a token of that kind of corruption. But anyway, that weird kind of paradoxical hypocrisy and inconsistency, all in the name of good things, wanting to promote good things. Anyway, this recording's gone on way too long, and I've sort of talking about too many different things, but the actual, let's say, liberal framing of moral issues that would actually tide us over into creating a better tomorrow and actually doing things properly, all is just being diluted by, sort of the climate crisis argument and, all of these sort of systemic oppression frameworks, morality, sociological excuses to impose sociological reductions, and morality sort of large scale dramatizations, that everyone can just be part of a faction therein. So there's a lot of cultural junk in the way of sort of getting back to basic principles and values. And it's not clear if that's possible, because to me it's not clear that journalists have the temerity and the backbone to go against the fear-mongering, which has so much cultural currency built into it. The sympathy grifting of, sort of pandering to the needs and desires of group pride and group dignity, and that kind of groupthink is just has been so normalized. It's hard to see how people are going to retreat from it, because although that this has happened in other forms of history, I think that because of, you see, like when you just had the radio, there were some people who understood identity politics in Weimar Germany. There were, these kind of Christian intellectuals who would, I mean, while Kristallnacht, the day of Kristallnacht, there was someone on radio who was essentially dismantling the whole Nazi worldview. He was arguing against it, and he was intellectually completely cutting it down. And then all of those types of people and all the comedians, sort of got assassinated, after the Nazis took over. So you have this, but now we have the internet, and we have sort of higher bandwidth channels of organizing or giving people access to understanding, the refutation of that kind of worldview, which then also gives us a kind of template as to why our, sense-making faculties as a society are, sort of corrupt and taken over and sort of almost designed with the algorithm of, sort of fear-mongering built into them, because, it's when you have an outraged audience, then it's very easy to sort of guarantee consumption of your product, or, sort of to keep on applying attention to what it is that you're producing. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would think that if Ukraine was more alone in this issue, they would have had to have made settlements. When I say settlements, I mean they would have had to be nicer to the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. They would have solved this problem already, I think. And obviously, you don't want Ukraine to be too left alone, because then maybe Russia would infiltrate it and take it over, and it would become a Russian satellite state, which is, slightly what perhaps Ukraine is on the pendulum swing of reacting to. So, I mean, I do think that in some sense it suffers from saying that it wants democracy, but it's too perhaps invested in this sort of cultural, anti-Russian sort of cultural identity project. And, maybe there is some good reason behind that, because, sort of the more Russian influence you have in your culture and in your politics, the sort of that sort of parallels kind of oligarchical tentacles taking over. But yeah, as far as I can see, the tentacles of the American kind of corrupt establishment, or has sort of just as many fingerprints on Ukraine. But anyway, I'm just repeating myself now, and I'm also, yeah, I'm perhaps, you see, my own knowledge about the specifics around this history makes it dangerous for me to make the comments that I have made, because I'm not well informed enough to know whether my general analysis is, at all respectful enough of salient factors. Um, but I mean, everyone knew this thing about Crimea. Everyone knew that in the 80s. I mean, everyone knew that that was something that was going to happen in the future.